Right. So the top three candidates, the first one would be Andrés Arauz with the Centro Democrático Party, and he will be the successor to the former president Rafael Correa, who was the former socialist president of Ecuador, who was in power from 2007 to 2017. Um, and through his socialist economic policies, Correa brought about 6 million people out of poverty, and he grew the middle class in Ecuador, and it was really a transformational time for the country. And so Arauz promises to continue on with those economic policies. Then we have Guillermo Lasso with the right-wing Creo party, and now Lasso and Arauz will be continuing on to the second round. And Lasso ran his campaign mainly on the idea of job creation by strengthening international investment and increasing oil extraction and increasing mining extraction. And the hotspots for these places in Ecuador are in the Amazon. And then you have in third place Yacu Perez with the indigenous Pachacutec party, and who got very, very marginally put into third place. There was a huge debate between Lasso and Yaku as to who was going to continue on to the second round, and this is still being disputed at the moment. But Yaku represents um, he ran his campaign on very strong anti-mining and anti-oil extractivist platform, mainly for the representing the indigenous communities who live close to these extraction sites. And so he wanted to change the extractivist dynamic in Ecuador and continue on with some public policies and public funding of education and healthcare, but it was a very strong anti-mining platform for Yaku. And so all these candidates are presented themselves um, against a government right now that is drastically unpopular. I mean, Lenin Moreno has been in power since 2017, and in this time, he's drastically cut funds to public education and healthcare. His administration has been awash with various corruption scandals. There was a massive protest in 2019 that lasted around 11 days. I think 11 or 12 people were killed under the context of the protests. The capital, Quito, was a total chaos. So he's been vastly unpopular. I think his popularity rating is about 6% right now and has been hovering around that for the past year and a half. So I think the current elections, the first round and the second round, represent really, well, the second round will represent people wanting a change from the current administration. Yeah, that's a very controversial point at the moment. There's definitely some supporters from the indigenous Pachacutic Party came and marched to Quito from the southern cities of Loja and Cuenca. So they marched for almost a week to get to Quito. There was a rally last week where probably 500 people showed up after that march, and I believe most of them are still in the capital now, and they continue to protest in front of the National Electoral Council, demanding that they recount the votes. And so what Yaku and other leaders who are helping him found was at least 20,000 counts of inconsistencies or inaccuracies in how the votes were being processed. And of those 20,000 examples that they found, and submitted to the National Electoral Council, they only accepted about 37 of them. So 37 over 20,000. And some of these inconsistencies are things like in the process of counting the votes, there's a certain number of votes for each candidate gets written on a page, and then someone else takes that page and puts it into the computer. And so there was inaccuracies between the numbers of what was counted and then what was put into the computer. Other examples are lack of signatures on these papers, so no one knows who was doing the counting, and certain little things like that. So I think a lot of the population do believe that there are inaccuracies, and whether this is fraud or not, there is inaccuracies that the National Electoral Council should account for. and especially indigenous populations who have for years have had very little trust in the government and are used to being told one thing and then having something else given to them. To be honest, I can't necessarily comment on who the authors of the letter were. I only know a couple of the academics who, from what I know, Arturo Escobar, for example, is one name that comes to mind, and there are a couple others who were familiar, and I know them from their work as environmentalists, as anthropologists, as people who work with communities. But I'm not familiar with everyone who signed the letter. But I think their concern comes with the fact that there's been, particularly in the international community, with people who support Rafael Correa and the socialist movements of Latin America, a huge demonization of Yacu Perez, people linking him with the right wing, both locally and internationally, and his links with the U.S. government, which, to be fair, is not hard to find those links. Yacu Perez is someone in the past who has been seen with the U.S. ambassador to Ecuador, and has gone to certain events at the U.S. Embassy. He, in the past, has supported Guillermo Lasso. I think famously in 2017, in the last elections, he said it's better to support a banker than to support a dictator. The banker being Guillermo Lasso of the right-wing party, and the dictator at that point being Rafael Correa, in his terms. So I think it's not hard to find these connections. I also think that ending the analysis there is a bit simplistic, because I think it has to be understood under the context that Yacu Perez is also an activist and has long been an activist against mining and against extraction in indigenous territories, but kind of in general. And he's known for his activism work to support water rights, which is also written in Ecuador's constitution, the rights of water and rights of nature. So Yacu Perez has long been an activist for that, and under Correa's administration, he was arrested several times for his activism in demonstrations, and certain protests and rallies and things like that. And also, I think it was in 2015, where he was arrested, and his partner, Manuela Pic, who is a Brazilian-French journalist, her visa was canceled and she was deported. And so I know Manuela Pic has her own controversial background. To be honest, I don't know much about that. But I think there was a lot of anger that came out of Yacu after these events and after being oppressed by the Correa government. And so when you see things like Yacu, he did support the coup in Bolivia in 2019. He did support the ousting of Dilma Rousseff and the trial of Lula in Brazil, which, by left-wing terms on the international scale, I think these are things that point to him being right-wing, which could be the case, but I also think it should be understood under the context of his deep distrust for the Correa administration and the lies that he was fed, and the distrust that a lot of indigenous communities have towards Correa, and Correa represents the socialist movements in Latin America at that time. So I think it's true that that the U.S. has some dirty history in Latin America and in Central America. I mean, U.S. institutions have supported some left-wing movements in areas which have led to the overthrow of presidents, democratically elected presidents, particularly Central America. I think the U.S. has also supported dictatorships in Chile and Argentina that led to autocratic governments and massacres in these countries. And so I think there's a reason why people are skeptical of the U.S. connection, and particularly their possible infiltration in left-wing movements in Ecuador. That's an interesting question. No one is speaking about that at the time. I think everyone is watching these elections closely because the OAS is here, the Organization for American States. They are here. They're present, and they're largely funded by the U.S. And they were also the organization that pushed the charges against Morales in the 2019 elections in Bolivia. And they pushed the idea that there was fraud in that election, which turned out to be untrue. But nevertheless, at the time, it still led to the ousting of Morales, who was forced to flee the country. And so I think that is very much on people's mind in the Ecuador's elections right now. And they're watching the OAS's reactions carefully. But I think up until now, this hasn't been the case that they have intervened in any direct way or any obvious way anyway. But I think it will be continue to be watched closely in the second round. I think it's a very complicated matter, and um, I do share that concern. I think the complication is that Ecuador is a country that is still being used for its resources, and economically, it's still entirely dependent on exporting its natural resources. And that includes mainly oil and mining, which is a growing resource as the price of oil drops. But both of those combined um, are over 6% of Ecuador's GDP. And then you have the agriculture industry, including like bananas and cacao and shrimping, which are also big exports. So Ecuador is a country that where its resources are necessary to keep the economy afloat. And one of the biggest impacts of that is that a lot of this is happening in indigenous territory. I mean, obviously, particularly oil and mining, which is happening a lot in the Amazon. So this is happening in indigenous territory. Um, where in certain cases during Correa's presidency, certain communities were actually basically displaced. Certain communities were displaced for the sake of large mining projects. And so I think the typical socialist argument that comes out of these movements, the Correismo and Nelson Morales in Bolivia, and also Argentina has been criticized for this, Brazil as well, that in order to bring the country out of poverty and to be able to invest in things like public education and public infrastructure, to create roads, to create alternative energy sources like hydroelectricity, all of which Korea was trying to do, you need to increase. You need the economy to make money, and so you're dependent on these extractive resources, and so but you're always going to be unpopular because this is going to be affecting a large part of the population. So I think a lot of this comes down to this complicated question in Ecuador right now. It's like what is left? Um, because in investing in public infrastructure, you need to then displace a community. Is it correct to do that for the good of the masses? And who gets to make that decision? And I think this is where a lot of the division between Yaku and Correa comes in, not necessarily in the leaders, because both are very controversial in their own right, but I think for the voting population, I think this is what is on people's minds. And then there's the other factor that Correa himself was very autocratic in how he did things. He did, and in addition to being very charismatic, he was also very firm in how he delivered messages. He called indigenous protesters terrorists. Um, he, at one point, when abortion was up for debate in Ecuador, he was completely against abortion and said that if the assembly passed it, if the National Assembly passed the to legalize abortion, then he would quit the presidency, and made like very jokes like this that really struck to the core of people, I think. And I think that's also one of the elements that this letter refers to, um, in the sense of like supporting this kind of dictatorial attitudes. I hesitate before calling Correa a dictator. I think it's a very strong word in Latin America. I don't think it should be thrown around lightly, but he did have very autocratic ways of delivering messages and for putting his political views, his personal views within politics. I think this is another element of like what is left, because Yacu Perez, while he does stand for anti-extractivist activities and pushes that, that's the main element of his politics. And at one point, he mentioned he congratulated Argentina for legalizing abortion, which implies that he's also pro-abortion, and so which makes him a friend to the feminist movement. Um, so there are these elements that promote progressive ideas, but then his economic policy is is actually not, it's not anything revolutionary. And he, supports public institutions, but then it's questionable where he stands on interest rates. It's questionable where he stands on the relationship with the central bank. And I think it's besides all of the potential connections to the right wing, him personally, whether that's true or not, he definitely has been shown to be useful to the right wing. And that I think there was even at one point when it looked like he might have gone to the second round, where several people within the right wing community were saying, well, it's better if it's better if Perez gets to the second round because then they'll have the indigenous vote and the right wing vote, and we have a better chance of winning. So I think there's definitely, people see some wiggle room in terms of his economic policies, which haven't been very clear, and nor has he really stated in a very clear way if you plan to not depend on the extractive industry, and if you want to not expand that, what is your other economic alternative? And he has not been very clear on that. And I think that's also where people see him as a benefit and where they could possibly, benefit from his lack of clarity there. I think the second round will be very interesting. So Arauz won right now with 33% of the vote, and Lasso is going ahead with just under 20% of the vote. So which means that they have a lot of votes to recover. And if you look at the first round, about 35% of the vote were split between Yacu Perez and the fourth place candidate, Javier Hervas. And Hervas, in a similar way, promoted progressive policies. He was also outwardly pro-abortion, and he's also with a left-wing, somewhat left-wing party that promotes progressive ideas in the social realm. But economically, they're not that revolutionary either. They have very centralist policies. And so it's really, I think, between Arauz and Lasso, there's wiggle room in how many and how that vote can turn out. I think though Correa has a strong base still with his supporters, I think there's also a lot of hatred towards Correa, um, for policies that I mentioned, and I think for his autocratic style. I think not a lot of people want to see a return to Correa, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't want his leftist policies, and that Arauz now has the possibility to show that he's someone different from Correa. He can continue on the same economic trajectory, but he needs to put his personality forward and show that he's not the same kind of he won't have the same autocratic governing style as Correa did. Whereas Lasso, now you see him trying to appeal to feminist groups and trying to appeal to the LGBTI groups, and wanting them to come in and form bigger unions. And a lot of them are now saying, are criticizing that, or being resistant of that, saying, well, no, you spent years turning down our proposals. But I think it's very important for the right wing now to try to be more progressive, at least in their social policies. And so I think it'll be very interesting going forward. I think one thing that was made clear in the first round is that people do not want the same right-wing neoliberal policies going forward. They do not want a continuation of this current government. Lasso's policies currently do represent that. So it'll be interesting to see how people go in the next round, whether the animosity towards Correaism will overtake that.